everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's book launch with Nghi Vo and R.F. Kuang, celebrating the launch of Nghi's spectacular novel, The Chosen and the Beautiful. My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the programs manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. Please let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I am speaking to you all from Brooklyn, New York, which is on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. For those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. At a time when these communities are specifically vulnerable, we continue to offer a space in which we can imagine a more just future. You can visit aaww.org or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. We are thrilled to be working with our friends at Books Are Magic this evening for this event. You can find a link to purchase copies of Nghi and Rebecca's books in the chat, and you can support one of our favorite local independent bookstores in doing so. The Chosen and the Beautiful is Books Are Magic's June fiction subscription pick, and you can learn more about their subscriptions at booksaremagic.net/subscriptions. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the hour, and you can ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I am going to briefly introduce Nghi and Rebecca, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming Nghi on screen to read from The Chosen and the Beautiful. Nghi Vo is the author of The Chosen and the Beautiful, her first novel out today, and the novellas The Empress of Salt and Fortune and When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, out from Tor.com. Her short fiction has appeared in Strange Horizons, Uncanny Magazine, Podcastle, Lightspeed, and Fireside. Her short story, Neither Witch Nor Fairy, was on the 2014 Otherwise, formerly Tiptree Award honor list. These days, she lives on the shores of Lake Michigan. Rebecca F. Kuang is a Marshall Scholar, translator, and the Nebula, Locus, and World Fantasy Award nominated author of the Poppy War trilogy. She has an MPhil in Chinese Studies from Cambridge and an MSc in Contemporary Chinese Studies from Oxford. She is now pursuing a PhD in East Asian Languages and Literatures at Yale. Please join me in welcoming Nghi, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening.
Soon enough, I was in bed with Daisy, hands clasped together and counting the stars in the night sky canopy over her bed. "Are you happy?" I asked. "Happiness must come later, don't you think?" she said in wonder. "When you want something so very much and then you have it." I almost asked her if she was talking about herself or Gatsby, but then the door opened and Gatsby and Nick entered. Daisy stayed where she was while I propped myself up on one elbow to look at them. Gatsby had all the self-satisfied swagger of an overgrown tomcat, and he pulled Nick behind him by the elbow. Nick was taller and thinner than Gatsby, but he did surprisingly well in a dove gray suit with the most discreet green stripe over a matching green shirt. The entire thing, I was certain, cost as much as Nick's rent for the summer did, and he wore it awkwardly, all angles and reticence. They came to stand on either side of the bed, and I reached up to twine my arms around Nick's neck, pulling him down for a kiss. "This is utterly mad," he whispered against my mouth, and I smiled. "It's a dream," I said, kissing him back. "Why not enjoy it for a little while?" We turned our heads and felt a little shabby at the fact that Gatsby and Daisy were barely touching at all. Instead, he was simply bent over her, ravishing her, worshiping her, and adoring her with just his eyes. Daisy herself looked like Sleeping Beauty, awakened, a delicate flush on her cheeks, and her lips slightly parted, if unkissed. It should have felt as if we were intruding, but these two were made for an audience. I could feel that Nick was quite taken with the picture they made. For my part, I only wondered if I should clap. Finally, it was Gatsby who broke the spell. standing back and helping Daisy to her feet. Come on, he said. Let me show you around the place. There's something Middle Western about the way he said it, I thought, as we followed him into the halls. Like the place might have been 100-acre spread of timber, or perhaps it was prime riverland that would be good for leasing out to hunters once the weather turned. Nick briefly tried to excuse himself, but Gatsby and Daisy wouldn't hear about it, and I wound my arm through his. Don't you dare leave me with just the two of them, I said with a grin. I do hate being a third wheel with you along. We'd rather complete the coup, don't we? Daisy insisted on seeing Gatsby's room before we went further afield, and we wandered through a room that was only Spartan compared to Daisy's, and if a room with its own mahogany bar could be said to be in any way lesser. She cooed over a solid gold mirror and comb while I inspected the drawers, where pocket watches and cufflinks were stored like prized jewels. In one velvet tray, I found a pigeon blood ruby. It was the size of my thumbnail, and for some reason it made Nick laugh. Where Daisy's was gracious and sprawling, Gatsby's rooms went up, his beautiful clothes located not in a polished and inlaid wardrobe, but in open cabinets and racks a story above, accessed by a winding staircase that uncurled into a brass walkway all the way around the room. I made Nick come up and choose something for himself, Gatsby said with a conspiratorial wink. I couldn't be nicer than that old thing. I like it, Nick said with a shrug and a slight smile. No, old sport, you should have had the peach, or the aqua certainly. Gatsby sprang up the delicate staircase to the upper story, drawing out shirts for me and Daisy to see. Look at this, he cried, shaking out a pale orange shirt with a winged collar. Wouldn't this be splendid on our boy? It's from England, and before that, Egypt. Or perhaps they call it Nile blue. Nick tried to laugh. Daisy clapped her hands for the colors, and Gatsby threw them down towards us, grabbing at linen shirts and cotton shirts in a mania, tossing them down to us by the handful. There was something here directed at Nick, but before I could figure it out, the shirts tumbling down towards us spun out and stretched out wings, sleeves stretching into long and graceful necks. As a dark blue shirt Gatsby named Vance from London spun past me, I caught a glimpse of a mother-of-pearl button eye before it swept up to the glass skylight above, followed in turn by the rosy plum from Paris and the lemonade yellow from Quebec. We gaped at the shirts that flew around our heads in a rush of fabric, rising up toward the gray glass sky. I saw Daisy close her eyes, but I watched as they gained the ceiling, and then, freedom just a shower of shattered glass away, they fell back defeated as shirts, falling back to the ground limp and disappointed. Gatsby opened his hands like a staged magician, and Daisy clapped, her eyes filled with strange tears. It struck me that there was something in her that wanted to speak, to cry out, perhaps in protest or in question, but she only smiled. What beautiful shirts they were, she cried. But for a moment, they had been birds.
Hey, me. I love that scene so much, especially the bird imagery, which of course recalls the bird imagery you've used in other crucial parts of the novel, including your twist on that iconic ending. It made me think of the way that scene is shot in the Baz Luhrmann adaptation, which I don't know if you have thoughts of how people had mixed feelings on it, but I really loved it. I
Oh, I thought it
thought
was
everyone
great
was
as well,
great in
wasn't
it.
it?
It's really excessive and indulgent and perfect, just like the novel. So the first thing I want to ask you is how you came to Fitzgerald, because I've been obsessed with Scotty since my youth, and your editor and I actually bonded over this. And I've always loved his work since I read it in high school, and I've never really been able to put my finger on why, because it's this world of excess and luxury and frivolous parties and drama, and it's a world that I have no place in and no business imagining myself in. And I've always tried to figure out what was the allure of the stories that F. Scott Fitzgerald was telling. And I wonder if it came down to jealousy or wishing that I could be a part of it. And obviously you love The Great Gatsby so much that you've written I think, better version of it. So what was the allure of Fitzgerald's work for you?
A very close encounter with my own mortality. I was nearly hit by a car in my high school parking lot on the day we started doing The Great Gatsby in high school. So, I mean, there was that. I mean, that wasn't special. I was really clumsy, and that was a really terrible parking lot. But more seriously, I think the whole appeal of it is just how big it is. It is for 42,000 words, there's a lot of story in there. And the characters in them, with the exception of, let's say, Nick, the characters are so big and they're so grand. And thanks to luxury and privilege that most of us are never going to be able to access, they're allowed to be just enormous, nearly caricatures of who they really are. And I think when you're a teenager, that kind of size and that kind of epic grandeur kind of appeals to you. I feel like that's how you feel things when you're a teenager. Everything is so big and it's so hard to contain. Of course, we're going to behave badly if it's just spilling out the edges, you know. And I think that's the appeal of Gatsby. It's the appeal of Daisy, at least for me, at least.
Yeah, speaking of teenage feelings, I saw the Baz Luhrmann film when on like a date that wasn't a date with a guy who I think was really into me, but I was like very much not trying to be into him. And then halfway through the film, he like snakes his arm around my shoulders, and I just remember thinking like, oh my God, like the emotions, the feeling of it all. Like I really sympathize with every character in this movie. So then my next question is why Jordan? Because Jordan is fascinating to me, but in the original, she's quite flat and a static character. She's just this very cool, catty introduction to the world, who is, you know, who receives no redemption at the end, and Nick and her ultimately part ways. And it seems to me that if you were going to write a retelling of the Great Gatsby about being an outsider, a foreigner, and not being welcome, then Gatsby himself is the obvious candidate. So why Jordan?
Jordan for a number of different reasons. First and foremost, it's the fact that Jordan actually is doing canonical things in the original text that we don't get to see. She is absolutely having secret conversations with Gatsby. She's having secret conversations with Daisy. And it feels like because of the joy of the limited narrator that is Nick, we never get to explore that. So of course, the first thing is, you know, it's the urge of someone who's always loved being behind the scenes. You kind of want to look over and see what's going on over there. More than that for me was the idea that you mentioned redemption, which I think is a great theme to bring up, because among other things, part of the joy of the Great Gatsby is the escape from consequences or the lack thereof. That's the big difference in the characters, and you know who suffers for what someone might consider a sin, who doesn't. And for Jordan doesn't need that. Jordan walks away from this car wreck, not to put too blunt a point on it, and that's a certain kind of liberty. It's also a kind of liberty that she gets to stand apart from the text, much as Nick does. And I have to imagine she's having her own dialogue about it in her head, about who is doing what, who is loving what, and who has made terrible, terrible choices this summer. There's the fact that when Nick describes her, he describes Daisy as being a very conventionally beautiful woman. And then you get to Jordan and the focus feels shifted, much the way that the focus feels shifted when he describes Gatsby. He's describing someone who is, to me, feels very other, who feels of a place but not from it, if that makes any sense.
Well, then the way that you've rewritten Jordan, that makes a lot of sense. I wasn't too into Jordan when I read the novel initially, but then I saw the Elizabeth Debicki version and reread it, and I thought, oh yeah, she's pretty cool. So we can't keep skirting the fact that this is a retelling, so I'm just going to ask a lot of craft questions about how you do that. So I'm really interested in this project of literary reclamation and decolonization, but it brings up all these thorny issues of, you know, what do you get by using the colonizer's voice to tell the story of the colonized, right? And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot over the past year as I've been drafting Babel, which is set in 1830s Oxford and very consciously imitates but tries to subtly refute the tone of the Victorian canon. And I ask myself a lot, like, is this truly liberatory, or does it, in its quest for liberation, just imitate, you know, something original and better? So I guess I have two questions here. The first is, what is the goal of a project like this, the way that you perceive it? And second, well, I have a lot of craft questions on a technical level, so I'll save that for after this question.
The reason why this was written was because this is a story that has lived in me for a very long time, ever since I was a teenager, ever since, you know, let's say 95, 96 or so. And here's the thing, it was given to me. There is a certain type of colonizer language they call civilization a gift. It is called, it is presenting something to hopefully make the unworthy worthy. And of course that's bullshit. Of course that's terrible. But I decided to run with that. The Great Gatsby, in a very intimate way, was a gift to me. The same way it's a gift to every American school student who sat through AP literature, I would think. And here's the thing, if it's a gift, I get to do what I want with it. It's mine now. So I guess you could say it is an act of ownership, an act of territory marking, which a little blunt, a little crude, but I think I'm gonna stick with that, I think. The idea of decolonization is a fraught one. I think it is a difficult one. Not that it's not work that is worth doing. I think it is work that is very difficult, especially for someone, say, in my position. I was born in the United States. I'm an American by birth and on paperwork. There is no taking that away from me. And American stories are my stories. So if I have to bear the responsibility of living and being a part of a colonialist nation, which I am, there is both a joy of ownership and the burden of ownership as well. So this is sort of collecting all of that together, making it mine, and then offering it back to see what happens.
I totally get that sense of ownership. I think for me, it's also a little bit about like spiteful proof of meeting aesthetic standards. Because in the case of like the Victorian canon, right, like you come up through K through 12 and you're told like, you know, Austen, Dickens, etc. Like this is the pinnacle of literature, right? This is white people's literature. Like this is the best that it's ever been at the height of empire. Like no one's going to match these. These are classics. And then to be able to consciously imitate that language, riff off of those sentences, and then poke fun at it and say, actually, no, like Dickens's pacing is very bad. I can do it better. That's a way of, you know, proving that we've escaped those aesthetic standards and that, you know, things that we're putting out today, you know, blow those old racist tales out of the water. So that for me is part of the allure of this sort of reclaiming project. And I think you do it so well. I mean, I was stunned so I knew it was a Gatsby retelling, but I didn't know that the prose was going to imitate F. Scott Fitzgerald's voice so closely on every level. I think your imagery is better. I like your turns of phrase better. But I mean, like how many times did you have to read The Great Gatsby in order to do that? Like what sort of vocal training, I guess, did you do to get your sentences sounding the right way?
It's really funny you mentioned vocal training because I'm going to point out this is the first time I've done a reading from The Chosen and the Beautiful, and I owe the woman who did my audiobook an apology and some chocolates. I did not write this book to be read at all, so it's kind of funny you bring that up. When it comes to the work that I did, to the scaffolding I had to set up to make The Chosen and the Beautiful work, I started by reading the book for the first time in a long time. I underlined everything that I didn't understand. And for a 21st century reader, that's actually a lot. There was so much in the text that I think would have been entirely clear to a reader from the 1920s or even the 1930s that went completely over my head, even as a teenager, even as a much careful reader later on. So I was doing a lot of underlining. I went back and did a lot of reading for everything that I annotated, everything from the Twilight Sleep to Nick's Regiment to the songs that were used, because the songs are used very pointedly in the book. And then I went back for a second reading and made myself a lot of little post-it notes, especially keeping in mind where Jordan shows up, where she is in any given scene. And then I added her to a few, which I felt, which I needed to do, because you can't have the Great Gatsby without certain scenes she's not a part of. So I'm like, how do I put her back in? So not quite so faithful as might be preferred, but from a craft perspective, it was really, really fun unpacking Fitzgerald's work. It is a very large novel folded into a fairly small one.
Yeah, I was just reading earlier today an interview with you where you'd mentioned that your word count more than doubles the 42K of, so that's crazy to me. Like I always thought that it was a much longer novel, and I can't believe you told that entire story and like the length of what we now consider a novella. And in that interview you mentioned it's because he does a lot of suggesting and then walking away from interesting spaces and scenes that he never fully describes, that you then fill in. So what are some of those, hidden spaces that you explore more?
The one that really hit me very hard was when Daisy in the original novel brings up the Twilight Sleep, which is a method of supposedly painless chemical birth, which she describes, and she's very quiet and reticent about it in the novel, although I can't tell whether that's Fitzgerald's choice or a censorship issue. But the Twilight Sleep was a method of drugging women who were about to go into labor, and it was supposed to be painless. They go to sleep, they wake up, and there's a beautiful, healthy baby in their hands, and that's the way it looks until you realize that it's not actually painless birth. It is just pain that they are meant to forget. And as the process came to the United States, as it was made more widely available by people who weren't necessarily as well trained as they could have been on the administration of scopolamine, there were women who were beginning to find themselves with these terrible memories of being tied down, of being in a great deal of pain without any sort of pain relief, giving birth. And that was deeply distressing, deeply traumatizing in a way that they had no tools to deal with. And I realized that's what Daisy went through, or a version of it. And that's terrifying. She is, when the novel starts, I believe Daisy is 22 or 24. She's so young to have a 2-year-old daughter and to have gone through that. On a much lighter note, Nick's a war hero, which was never emphasized to me when I was reading the book in the first place. I looked up his regiment. He's part of the Black Lions of Cantigny, I think. I've probably mispronounced that. I used to know, I don't know anymore. Which was part of the first regiment in France, first American regiment in France during World War I. So that is telling us something about Nick, I think, that a 1920s reader would have carried right into the text, and which we sort of just gloss over. It's very quick, and but I think it's meaningful to who he is and who I make him in my version.
Yeah, I think that, throwaway references to really horrible histories and horrible phenomena is a thing that you discover a lot in the Victorian canon too. A famous example of this, right, is in Mansfield Park, where there's just this throwaway line that Edward Said later, jumps on, where they're asking where the father of this rich family is, and they're just like, oh, he's in the West Indies. I wonder what he's doing in the West Indies. And it's just so casually worked in there, but to any contemporary reader, it's like he was going to the West Indies to oversee his slave plantation because this man owned slaves. And it's just like, such a fact of life for the people in that novel that it's not even worth further commenting on, which is why, right, like a project like Babel and a project like The Chosen and Beautiful You is so fruitful, because we get to expand that, because these throwaway references to the marginalized, the subaltern, the oppressed, etc., like those are stories that deserve telling. So I really like the way that you've told this one. I want to ask now about the way that you've reimagined a lot of the characters' races. Well, Jordan obviously is a Vietnamese adoptee, but then interestingly, Gatsby, in the text, it says that he has a half Choctaw mother whose other half is not white, if I'm remembering that correctly. And in the story, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it makes a lot of sense on many levels, including the kind of magic that he is able to work. But it's also very fraught, literary technique, because it also brings to mind other attempts of changing the race of characters, such as the whole discourse around Shadow and Bone, when the main character, Alina, is now, is half Chinese, or this world's equivalent of being Chinese, and there's been a lot of criticism about how it's, it's a random fact of her that's been changed, but there is no acknowledgement of history or exactly how her experience would have been shaped by being biracial. So how do you address those concerns when you're doing your, race change representations, and how do you avoid that, random switch without an acknowledgement of the history behind it?
With a great deal of care, a great deal of nervousness, and an understanding that I may not have gotten it right. I think that's something that if you're working if you're working with identity at all, I think that's something that we should be aware of and we should be responsible for. I was trying to be about as honest as I could be, especially when I was looking up experiences of people of mixed race from the 1920s, the politics of passing, the politics of difference, for example, and the choices that Jordan has made, and the choices that Gatsby himself has made, because it's not a great choice, but it is still a choice. And I tried to make them choices that the characters themselves would make, while understanding that at the bottom of it, I'm the writer, and those are my words. Those are absolutely all mine. So if there's any credit to be given there, it belongs to the people I imagine they are. And if there's any fault, that's absolutely mine. I think that, but also on top of it, I think that there is something to be said in the original. There's actually some really interesting essays out there that speculate on Gatsby's race. As we talked about, Fitzgerald puts a lot into a very small space. And these scholars have said it far better than I have, where they speculate on whether Gatsby is white. He is definitely seen as white. He has the privilege of being a rich white man, but given how much of Gatsby is created, the question becomes, is it possible that his own racial identity is something that he created himself? And I think that's a very interesting question that is worth answering. I don't explore it nearly as much as it might deserve, but I felt that was a good fit for a lot of the things I was trying to do.
Yeah, I've read a couple of those papers as well as I was preparing for tonight, and I think it's a fascinating theory. I don't know if Scott Fitzgerald was the right person to tell a story about, passing in the 1920s, but I think that the way you handled it was quite sensitive and exactly just the right touch. So I've been peppering you with really difficult questions about craft and writing philosophy, so I want to give you the chance to just talk about something really cool and expand on that. So tell us about the paper cutting magic that Jordan is able to do.
Okay, the paper cutting magic is really interesting to me. When I looked into the history of paper cutting in Asia, it seems it is originally Chinese, far back into the earliest histories and the earliest traces of it we have. It has spread out to become what seems to me to be a very pan-Asian sort of art form. But one of the interesting things that struck me from the very beginning of it was that it was a domestic craft. This is a craft that goes back to people beginning to beautify their homes. It starts with paper by definition, but before that, it was people making cuttings in fabric, even in leaves or in leather, to with scraps that have no other use, to make their homes more beautiful and more palatable to them. It's decorative art. It has had religious connotations. It has had holiday connotations, of course. And what I loved about it was so much care and so much love being put into something that was by definition so very ephemeral and so very fragile. A good rain washes it away. Careless step knocks it right off the wall and tears it. But given the detail with which so many people committed these works of art, I think it's wonderful. I think that is just a kind of very human and very normal magic that that people have engaged in. And if there was a gift I wanted to give Jordan, it was something like that. They seemed like a natural match just about from the very beginning. And it felt right when I put it together, and when I put it in terms of her heritage and in terms of the paper cutting troupe that she eventually meets, and all of that together.
Right, yeah, because later it does become a very good opportunity for her to reconnect with her heritage and, in her conversations with Kai and discussions of belonging, etc. I thought those were some of the best additions that you made to Fitzgerald's original story. And in a way, paper cutting is such a good metaphor for the entire philosophy of wealth, I guess, and excess in the original Great Gatsby, right? Like everything is ephemeral, everything can vanish in an instant, everything is an illusion, and all this wealth is just a show and it can go away. If, for example, people find out that you don't have the right history or you are in fact opening up a gateway to hell. But I want to talk also about Daisy and her water witch abilities. So why does that make sense for that character?
Um, Daisy was a character that I was very hard on when I was growing up. If you're a teenage girl, there is absolutely no reason to love Daisy, I think. She is, it's too clean, it's too perfect how, if there's a villain in the story, it's not hard to make it Daisy. It's not hard to villainize her for her lack of care for her wealth. And, some of that she deserves, and some of it she really doesn't. Like I said, she is so young in the book, and that's not something that a 16-year-old appreciates, I think, because, at that age, everyone's just an adult. But when it comes right down to Daisy, I wanted this sense not only of wealth and power and beauty, but also this sense of sort of wasted potential. The idea that she's not as trapped as anyone else is, because once again, she's rich, but she is very much constrained by the person she has chosen to be. And the person she has chosen to be isn't in a great place. I think it's pretty clear as I write the book that Daisy is deeply unhappy. I think that it's also very clear that if she put the will into escaping it, Daisy could. Daisy has a lot of untapped potential, both magical and personal, potentially also political. She's one thing that kind of got me when I was doing my reading and putting this on an American history timeline is Daisy has had the right to vote for just 2 years. Jordan doesn't have it at all. And I think that as I went through and as I did my reading, I wondered, does that change who I think Daisy is? And in a conversation with my agent, Diana Fox, we both clearly agreed, no, Daisy did not vote. That is not something that she really would have done. She can, but she's not going to. She's busy that day or thinks it's silly. But when I look at Daisy these days as an adult who is now twice her age, from a distance from great distance from where I was when I first read her as well, I see the waste and I see the sorrow, and I also see the luck that placed her in a place where she can survive all of that, where the waste is not a tragedy, but something more like a fashion choice, maybe.
So you've just been quite kind to Daisy, but my next question is going to be quite unforgiving of Daisy, because the original text is quite unforgiving of her.
Absolutely.
And even though you've just, given very good reasons for why we should be more sympathetic to her, I think that your interpretation is also quite unforgiving of her ultimately. And wow, there's a lot I could talk. Well, so first of all, the scene where I wonder if it's too much to give away, where we see her with a shovel, right? And she's just so casually doing those things with the shovel. That really struck me, especially how Jordan is sick with love with her and remains sick with love with her for her even after that. And the scene where Jordan says something like, "I don't love you anymore," and Daisy's like, "No, of course you do." And that dynamic is so interesting to me, and especially in relation to the white womanhood and the white femininity of Daisy, and the sort of white feminism, I guess, that you could apply to revisionist redeeming interpretations of her. But partially for me, this love of Daisy on the part of Gatsby, but also in your version on the part of Jordan, represents loving a world that will never love you back, which maybe I'm reaching here, but also to me represents, wanting to be a part of white supremacy, knowing that it is never going to accept you back. I think a lot about how Frank Wilderson describes, Asian people as junior partners to white supremacy. And I don't super agree with this, but I guess I'm getting at a nexus of issues of wanting to be in this elite, knowing that you'll never quite fit in, and being sick with love at the fact of that. And I wonder if any of that came to mind for you as you were drafting. I know that was a lot of different things at once, but I'm curious about your thoughts.
No, that's fantastic. I might have soft pedaled it in my last section, but one thing we must never lose track of is the fact that Daisy is dangerous. She proves to be very dangerous to Gatsby in the original novel. And as we have seen very obviously in the past few years, given who calls the cops and who support, and basically who brings the cookies to the white supremacy bake sale, there is a type of white womanhood and femininity that is dangerous, and that's Daisy. We get into the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, Daisy is pretty, Daisy is beautiful, Daisy is charming. And part, I think, of growing up female in the United States, envy is a part of it. We're taught to envy. Especially if you're not white. And, part of envying is wanting. And I think part of the work of decolonization is to think about what we are wanting. Do I want white skin? Do I want blonde hair? Or do I just want power? And I think we're getting into something that it's difficult to parse sometimes. And especially it's something that you really only acquire the tools for when you start thinking and when you start taking it apart, because the feelings are there. The feelings are there in us from when we're very young. However, when we start actually looking at what is behind those feelings that kind of make us ashamed about what we might want, I think we find something more honest. And I think we find something very vital. And in that envy, I think there is some power in that. I think there is some grace. And I think there is some utility, more importantly.
I think that's a really good way of putting it, because it really comes full circle to the first question I asked you about why Fitzgerald, why is this world so enticing? And it's for similar reasons that I was so obsessed with shows like Gossip Girl when I was in college, knowing that I did not have the face to be a part of that world, knowing that, I don't have the wealth to be a part of that world, but wanting it so badly anyways, and feeling bad about wanting it, and then, being a Marxist, and then being all confused about the politics of want. So reading The Chosen and the Beautiful was a really good way to work through all those messy high school and college feelings about to be honest with myself, wanting to be a part of white supremacy and, dealing with that. And it's a good thing to be able to confront, because then you can think about, ways in which to take it apart and fight back against. So the next question I have for you is about historicity. You do a lot of historical situating and referencing events that are going on in other parts of the world, like domestic legislation in the States, that Scott Fitzgerald doesn't do really. When I read Gatsby, I get the sense that, even though some of the world details are specific to the Roaring Twenties, you get the sense that this is a story in a secluded fairy tale that could take place almost anywhere. So what are those linkages to other parts of the world and other things that are going on? Like, you make a lot of references to the Manchester Act. So what are those, and what are you doing with creating those linkages?
The Manchester Act is fictional. I made that up, but it is based very closely on the immigration acts of the 1920s, which were targeted at just about any non-white ethnic group coming into the United States, but very specifically towards people of Asian descent. It was a very political move that had the effect of inflicting a great deal of distress and violence and death on the Asian American community at the time. And that is the dark shadow that is hanging over Jordan that she is not looking at. It is something that the paper cutting troupe she runs into, Kai and Bai, they understand that darkness very well. And that's why at the end of the book, they leave. They're gone because they know exactly what kind of trouble that it's going to be. And as Jordan's aunt puts it, my dear, you're rich. You have nothing to worry about. And that's a various truth for Jordan, who is rich, but is also not white. I wanted the Manchester Act from my work to sort of create this sense of menace that really was present in the 1920s, and I think, fairly speaking, is potentially also in the original novel as well. The 1920s were a time of excess and glitter and light and power. And however, if you know your history, the 30s are fast on its heels. And so there's the Manchester Act. There's also the colonization of Vietnam, which is in there more or less whole cloth. I don't actually think I changed very much besides adding some paper soldiers. The missionaries were there, the guns were there. More than that, what I was trying to strike with the history specifically, what I really wanted to get right was the material quality of the 1920s, the advent of manufacturing, the fun of advertising being this wonderful thing that introduces us to the wonders of the modern world, instead of being this irritating thing we have to click through 4 or 5 windows to now when we're trying to get to the articles we want to read. So in a lot of ways, the 1920s were magical to the people coming out of the teens and World War I and the Spanish flu. So I wanted to make sure that was a part of it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense regarding the Manchester Act, because I remember after I read it, I Googled it and I was like, okay, this like feels important, but what is it? And I couldn't all the articles. So I kept ending up on articles about immigration, interestingly enough, but the Manchester part would always be quoted in the Manchester newspaper, etc. And I was like, what is this legislation? What am I missing? Okay, so that clarifies things a lot more. I also wanted to mention when Jordan is talking to her aunt about this legislation, her aunt doesn't just say you're rich. She says, no, you don't have to worry about that. You're a baker, which is fascinating to me and gets some of the politics of adoption and passing for Jordan. And one line elsewhere that really stuck with me is when Jordan is thinking about the way she was adopted out of Vietnam by her mother, and I think what her mother said was, oh, you were the prettiest baby, so I took you. And there is no explanation of what happened to her parents and whether or not they're actually dead. So I didn't know if you wanted to comment more on why you choose this particular phrasing of "you're the prettiest baby and I took you."
Specifically, we don't see anything of Eliza Baker. She's very dead by the time the story starts, but I wanted to emphasize her childishness. I wanted to emphasize her sense of ownership and why she had absolutely no problem doing what she did. I've seen in the advertising copy, in the reviews, I see Jordan get referred to as an adoptee, and that phrasing is not wrong, but kidnapping victim actually works just as well, if not better. So I wanted to be very clear about who Eliza Baker was, and whether or not I succeed is probably up for grabs. But in my mind, I know who Eliza Baker is, and Jordan is figuring it out towards the end, when she gets that creeping sense of realization of why she is where she is and why she is who she is.
That's dark. So the last question I had for you before we get to the Q&A is, what is coming up next, and can we expect more with Jordan Baker or more historical retellings?
Let's see. Next up next year is Siren Queen, which is vaguely in the same world but does not include Jordan. It is a Chinese-American actress in a Hollywood runoff Fairyland Rules, trying to earn her star, and that's Lily Wei, and I love her so much. That is the first novel I've ever written, and I can't wait for everyone to meet her. There is a novella coming up. Well, no, it's a novel. That I've been referring to as 200 Years of Grief and City Planning. And I do get to talk about this, actually. There is another novella which is tentatively called Don't Sleep with the Dead, which follows up on Nick in the events after The Chosen and the Beautiful. And we absolutely will get a Jordan cameo. And in case anyone is worried, she is doing a Jordan level of fine.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that there's more coming in the Gatsby verse, because I know that the original Great Gatsby doesn't leave much room for the sequel, but I am just so in love with your prose and am super excited to read that novella when it comes out. So we've got some audience questions, and let me just scan them quickly. So here's a pretty easy one. If you haven't actually read The Great Gatsby, would you recommend reading it before The Chosen and the Beautiful or after?
Before, because then you can see me being mean about things. I get a little mean about things.
I think that you should always go from the worst to the best. So I think you should read Fitzgerald first and then read The Chosen and Beautiful, because
That's very
basically
kind.
a lot from there. Then Buffalo is asking, who do you think Gatsby slash Daisy slash Nick would be today? Tragic Instagrammers?
Oh my God. Yes, I love them as Instagrammers. I think that I think Jordan, man, I love the idea of Jordan being an Instagrammer who just lets everyone in on her day. And then slowly, as she gains more consciousness, her streams get darker and they start bringing in more social issues. And I mean, she's still the person she is, but she looks down and realizes, wait, I think fair trade might mean a lot less than I thought it means. And Nick is perpetually broke and trying to keep up with everyone. I know that for sure. And honestly, I mean, is it too easy to make Gatsby just a drug dealer? That feels kind of right to me.
No, I think Gatsby is just Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf of Wall Street. It's just
Actually, Leonardo
that too
DiCaprio, I'll
is a
take it.
Gatsby retelling. And I think Nick would be like, he would still have a live journal somehow, and he
Oh
would
my
be like
God.
live blogging his friends' lives. So here's a pretty literary question that has some references that I don't fully understand. So
Oh, sure.
anonymous attendee, you may want to expand on that in the chat. Can you speak to whether Daisy's water wish slash, oh, let me scroll back up. Fey origin is, among other influences, a nod to the Melusine legend, which is also a kind of reverse Bluebeard as well. Don't look at her in her bath, a beautiful woman above the waist and a monster below.
I wish I was that smart. No, Daisy's association with water comes from it comes from a lot of things, but there's the idea of the changeability of her nature. There's the fact that there's something about the essence of her is shaped by whatever vessel she is in and where she is splashed. Some of it is just the fact that when I looked up the geography of Louisville, it's a river town like Peoria, where I grew up, and the river exerts such a degree of gravity and power and nature to the towns that they flow through. And not that I would really claim any kinship with Daisy gladly, but she's a river girl.
So Claudia wants to know about the process of including magic into the world of The Great Gatsby. And I am also curious more broadly, not just about the various characters' magical abilities, but about this, ongoing magic that just runs through this entire environment that all the characters know about and are familiar with, that seem to just match so well with the spirit of the Roaring Twenties. How do you conceive of a magic system? Well, it's not really systematic, is it? It's really just vibes. So how do you decide what magical traditions to draw from, and how do you make them fit the tone of the story so well?
I needed more than anything for it to fit New York City in the 1920s. And the best way for me to conceptualize it was through electricity, actually. So in the 1920s, we have light. We have light in a way we've never had it before. But on the other hand, we're still in that transition period. We still have the lights of New York. We still have people who are using candles in more rural parts. We're seeing the beginnings of mass communication. We have whole towns that don't have phones. We have gorgeous gold-plated bathrooms, and we have dug latrines. So I think if there's anything in the way that I create the magic, it was the idea of the time of both having and not having, and how magic becomes this thing that separates people who can do it and the people who can't, or the people who have some of it and the people who have none. And you have people like Daisy who have plenty of it and then choose not to use it.
That's really cool. That's very similar to the way that I thought about magic in Babel, because it's so closely tied to the Industrial Revolution for me, which I've called the Silver Industrial Revolution. And it is also about, haves and have-nots, and the way magic as an industrial technique can speed up inequality and, unfair labor conditions and social instability, etc. So I really like the way that you've written it. Anonymous attendee wants to know, do original stories and retellings hit different spots for you creatively? / is there a certain headspace that you get to for choosing one over the other?
I think speaking for me and speaking for a lot of people, my brain spits out stories. It's just a matter of catching them as they go by before, I get distracted with stuffing something in my face or watching the next thing I want to see on Netflix. Um, Stories are just stories, and you go far enough back and we all have our own influences. We're all very derivative, I think, and at some point you do have to let go of that fear, because humans, we're stories all the way down, and I don't know where they come from, and unless there's the very pat answer of they come from the world around us, the way everything does. But I think for me, it's just a story, whether it starts off with two girls being blown around a house, or whether it starts off with, last month I got so freaking drunk and you'll never guess where I ended up. It's a story.
Also, I'm curious from a craft perspective, since you've written very original novellas and also, this retelling, if you find the existence of the original restrictive or liberating, because, you don't really have space to, well, I guess you do interesting things to the plot, but there's a scaffolding that exists, right, that you hew pretty close to. And I have thoughts about this also because I've experienced with what it's like to write with an existing IP and tell a different story, a story from a different perspective. But so what is the process like for doing a retelling like this and doing something totally original? Like, is it called the Singing Hills series? I'm not sure what the
Singing
name
Hill Cycle, yeah.
Yeah. So what are those, how do your approaches differ when you're doing one or the other?
I hope it is very clear that I am deeply in love with The Great Gatsby as a novel, for all of its problems, for all the places where it does sort of backhand people who are not Nick, basically. It is a text that is very dear to me, and I don't know if I felt straitjacketed by it so much as I felt that I liked it so much that I wanted to stay as close to it as I could. It allows me to comment on not only the world of the novel itself, it allows me to comment on the world that Fitzgerald himself is living in and the assumptions he makes. And that's actually a thing to think about. I don't know how clear it is in the original novel, but Jordan drives drunk. I'm not sure how often she does it, but she does it at least once. And that was something that I kept trying to find a way to put into my novel, and I don't know if I did it very successfully. I don't know if it's very clear that that's what she's doing, but that's part of the world as well. It's if I follow the original novel, I get taken to all sorts of really interesting places I get to try to pry open, and that didn't feel limiting. It felt very close. It felt weirdly loving.
I had the opposite experience. I had to write a short story, or not had to, I got to write a short story for The Empire Strikes Back from another perspective. So I got to write about Dak Ralter, Luke Scudder, who dies in the Battle of Hoth. But it was just so frustrating, like double checking the script and watching like 10 minutes of the film over and over again so I could get all the descriptions and dialogue and sequencing right. And yeah, it was fun because, as you mentioned, like a lot of the work is done already for you, so you get to explore things that are not explored in the original. But it's so much cross-checking. I don't know how you did it with your post-it notes. I would not repeat that exercise, but you did it very well. So an anonymous attendee would like to know, so first of all, they're complimenting us. This has been a very wonderfully insightful event so far. In your research for The Chosen and the Beautiful, did you come across books/movies that you would recommend reading?
Books/movies, let's see. From the time period, I would say that Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies, which was turned into the film Bright Young Things, influenced a lot of the crowd that Jordan hangs out with. Let's see. I also really enjoyed, I'm sorry, the name escapes me now, but I will say that one of the biggest influences on this work was Kate Beaton's comic, which is called The Great Gatsby, which is kind of all over the internet with Daisy sitting on her baby saying, "What baby?" And that influenced it a lot more than I think people really know about. Charlie Chaplin films. Those were great. I was really enjoying the break from the talkies to the early speaking movies, and the weird humor of the 1920s and the broadness of it actually resonates really well with Fitzgerald, which is a strange mix now that I think about it.
That's interesting. I like Kate Beaton's comics so much. I love her Wuthering Heights ones. I remember laughed so hard, but I didn't know they were Gatsby ones. I have to go check them out now.
Oh, The
Daisy's
Great
sitting
Gatsby
on
was
her
amazing.
baby. that just sounds so right. So then our last question. I loved reading the scenes in the Centurion. Can you say more about your process writing the setting and its significance for the characters?
I went to a lot of queer clubs back in the 90s and the early aughts. I think there's something to be said for being someone who's actually not only not very fond of parties, but also but still has to go, that makes you a pretty good observer of what makes a party work. The Cendrillon itself comes from my readings into queer spaces and queer clubs. My focus was more in the 40s and the 50s. The information going back to the 20s is a little sparser, but is absolutely still there. The Cendrillon is a dream and a memory and just a lot of fun. And like any club, it's a lot of people making a lot of bad decisions. So, you know, if you go there and you just want to watch things, it's great.
Those scenes gave me a lot of secondhand social anxiety because every time I think, I'm ready to go to a club, I get there and I realize like I'm actually so bad at this and I don't like being around people and loud noises. So it's so chaotic, but it is nice to read about from a distance when I can put the book down and walk away when it feels overwhelming. It was very cool.
Thank you both so much. I will cut in to thank you. This has been so absolutely fascinating. I feel like we've sat through a masterclass on the Great Gatsby, as well as like such a fascinating discussion about your inspirations behind this book, Nghi. I'm so grateful for both of you for being here, Nghi for writing this book, Rebecca for all of these questions, and the audience as well for the incredible questions that you submitted. I want to thank everybody again. I want to call for a sort of virtual round of applause in the Zoom chat, please, for Nghi and Rebecca. I want to thank our incredible ASL interpreters from Pro Bono ASL, Mark, who is on screen right now, as well as Chris, who was on screen earlier, and our captioners as well. Thank you all so much for making this event accessible. This event and others, you can find out more about the work that the workshop does. You can watch previous events on our YouTube channel. We have a bunch of stuff coming up this June. Our next event is June 10th. It is with the musician and activist Anik Khan and the writer Clover Hope, talking about Black and Brown musical influences and culture. We are going to turn the music back on for a little bit and leave the Zoom open for a few minutes. If you want to hang out in the chat for a moment, you are welcome to. Connect with our authors and other audience members and the workshop staff. If you'd prefer to sign off, I want to thank you again so much for joining us online, and hope everybody has a wonderful night and takes care and stays safe out there. And thank you again, Nghi and Rebecca, for this incredible evening. It has been so much fun. Such a huge pleasure.